Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's story. In this episode, James proudly introduces Diep as his fiancée, but instead of celebrating, his friends mock her for being poor and plain. Whispers and cruel remarks test her confidence, but James refuses to back down. Stay with us until the very end of this story to see how James's determination changes the way Diep sees herself. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us. The morning sun rose high over the worksite, its heat pressing down on every grain of sand. Diep bent low, her small hands gripping the wooden shovel, each scoop cutting into the pile with a steady rhythm. Sweat streaked her cheeks, soaking the faded shirt clinging to her thin frame. Her breath came heavy, but she pushed through, as though every scoop of sand carried the weight of her struggles. She had just bought 3 bags of cement for 200,000 VND, thinking it would be enough. But the seller's voice still echoed in her mind. "It's 300,000, miss. You're short." The words had been simple, but they struck her like a hammer. Now she had only 200,000 left, and the remaining debt clung to her chest like a rope, squeezing tighter with every thought. As she worked, the scrape of the shovel against the rough ground blended with the market sounds nearby. Children's laughter floated in the distance, mingling with the call of vendors. Yet to Diep, the world felt muted. Each movement of her arms was not just labor, but survival. Her family needed money, and dreams she once carried. Dreams of school, of travel, of something better, felt like shadows slipping further away. But she didn't stop. The relentless sun beat down, the sand shifting beneath her sandals, unstable like the very ground of her life. Still, she pressed forward, even though a quiet fear whispered within. Would she ever escape this cycle? Later that afternoon, the marketplace buzzed with life. Vibrant stalls lined the path, filled with fruits, fabrics, and voices rising in song-like chatter. Diep, her face still carrying traces of dust, followed James closely. His tall frame moved with ease through the crowd, while she clutched her bag tightly, her steps hesitant. They stopped at a clothing stall, fabrics swaying gently in the breeze. James's eyes softened as he picked up a green dress. "Try this one, Diep," he said, his voice carrying warmth. She shook her head quickly, tugging at her worn shirt. "I'm not used to dresses," she murmured, her tone quiet, almost apologetic. The thought of stepping into something beautiful felt like stepping into a world that wasn't hers. But James's smile was patient. He held the dress out, urging her gently toward the fitting room. "Just try it. I want you to feel confident." Inside, the mirror reflected a stranger. Diep's calloused hands and tired eyes seemed at odds with the elegant fabric hugging her frame. She ran her fingers along the seams, torn between gratitude for James's kindness and the sharp sting of unworthiness. When she stepped out, James's eyes lit up. "It's beautiful," he whispered, his gaze steady. But all Diep saw was contrast. His world of success and stability standing against her life of debts and endless labor. She thought of the 100,000 VND she still owed, of the long hours at the worksite, of sleepless nights counting coins. The dress felt heavy, not from its fabric, but from the weight of her insecurities. The marketplace bustled around them, yet inside her chest was a storm. Could his generosity truly bridge the distance between them? Or would it only shine a brighter light on the fragile place she held in his life? That evening, the warm glow of a restaurant welcomed James and Diep. Lanterns hung from the ceiling, casting soft light across polished wooden tables. The laughter of James's high school friends filled the air, echoing with old memories and easy familiarity. Diep sat quietly beside him, the new dress smoothing against her knees. Her heart pounded, her hands resting stiffly on her lap. James, with his steady confidence, placed a hand over hers and smiled. "This is Diep, my fiancée," he announced with pride. For a moment, silence swept across the table. His friends exchanged glances, their smiles tight, their eyes scanning her in a way that made her skin prickle. One of them, a man with a sharp grin, chuckled lightly. Diep, could you bring me another bowl? This one's chipped." Diep froze, her cheeks burning hot. For a split second, she wondered if she had truly mistaken her place at the table. Her voice wavered as she answered, "I'm not a server." The table quieted. James stood quickly, his voice firm. "She's not a server. She's my fiancée." Apologies followed, awkward smiles attempting to smooth over the sting, but the damage had been done. Diep sat in silence, her pulse racing, the edges of her vision blurring with humiliation. Moments later, another friend arrived, sliding into the empty chair. His eyes widened as he looked at Diep. "Wait, Diep is James's fiancée. I thought she was already married." The words cut deep, like glass against her skin. Diep's throat tightened. Her hands clenched together beneath the table. The rumor hung in the air, poisoning the moment, and all she could do was lower her gaze. Her ears caught fragments of conversation around her, mentions of villas, companies, overseas projects, all things far from her reach. She thought of the dusty worksite, the unpaid debt, the sand clinging to her shoes. James squeezed her hand again, grounding her. His voice carried warmth as he spoke to his friends about staying in Vietnam, about building his family's company here. He spoke with pride, his words rich with hope. But Diep's mind was miles away. Each laugh from the table echoed in her chest, like a reminder that she didn't belong. Her reflection in the polished wood of the table looked small, fragile, like a leaf adrift in a rushing river. Finally, she whispered, "I'm tired. I need to go." James turned to her, concern in his eyes, but she rose before he could answer. The restaurant's glow faded behind her as she stepped into the night. Her new shoes pinched her feet, each step a sharp reminder of the night's wounds. The streetlights cast long shadows, and her figure stretched thin against the pavement, a worksite girl in a glittering world that didn't feel like hers. Diep thought of James's unwavering love, his hand holding hers, his voice introducing her proudly. Yet in her heart, doubt swirled. Could their love truly bridge the divide? Or would she always be an outsider, measured not by who she was, but by what she lacked? The night air was cool, brushing against her face, but inside her chest, a faint spark glowed. She would not give up. The path ahead might be thorny, the whispers might never fade, but she would keep walking. Each footstep echoed softly, a rhythm of resilience. The city's hum dimmed, leaving only the steady beat of her resolve. Somewhere between James's love and her own fears, Diep searched for her place, a fragile figure caught between two worlds, but determined not to let either define her. The next morning dawned bright, the golden light stretching across the rooftops of the city. Diep sat on the edge of her bed, her hands folded in her lap, her thoughts restless. The memory of the restaurant clung to her. The laughter, the sideways glances, the sting of careless words. She had left quietly, but her heart had been anything but calm. James, however, was not one to ignore the storm. He knocked gently on her door and stepped inside, his eyes carrying both worry and warmth. "Diep," he began softly, "I know last night wasn't easy, but I want you to know something. What I said is true. You are my fiancé. Nothing changes that." Diep looked up, her eyes shimmering with doubt. "But your friends, they don't see me that way. To them, I'm just a poor girl who doesn't belong in your world." James crossed the room and knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "Let them think what they want. Their opinions don't matter to me. What matters is us, you. Do you think I'd let a few cruel words decide my future?" His voice carried both conviction and tenderness, the kind of certainty she longed to believe in. Yet still, inside her heart, a quiet voice whispered fear. She wanted to trust, but the wall between their worlds felt impossibly high. Later that day, James insisted on bringing Diep along to visit a project site. His company was overseeing construction in the area, and he wanted her to see what his daily life looked like. The site buzzed with workers, the hum of machinery filling the air. James moved confidently among them, exchanging greetings, explaining blueprints, listening to reports. Diep trailed slightly behind, her gaze lowered. She felt the eyes of workers flicker toward her, some curious, others questioning. Was she out of place here too? James, noticing her unease, called her forward. "Everyone, this is Diep," he said, his voice clear. "She's not just visiting, she's my fiancé." The words struck her like a spark. He didn't hesitate, didn't soften them, didn't hide her. He said it proudly, in front of everyone. Some of the workers smiled and nodded respectfully. Others looked surprised, but James didn't waver. He guided Diep to his side, and in that moment, she felt a small seed of courage take root. Still, whispers followed. She caught snatches of words, comments about her simple clothes, her plain looks, the contrast between them. Each remark pricked at her heart, but James's hand on her shoulder reminded her she wasn't alone. That evening, James invited a smaller circle of friends to his apartment. He wanted Diep to meet them in a more comfortable setting, away from the noise of restaurants and the sharpness of crowds. The apartment was warm and inviting, filled with books, framed photos, and the faint aroma of tea. Diep sat quietly at first, unsure of how to fit into their lively conversation. But James guided her gently, asking her about her work, her family, her dreams. Slowly, she began to speak. Her voice carried honesty, even if it lacked confidence. She spoke of the market, of long hours under the sun, of debts that weighed on her shoulders but never broke her spirit. The friends listened politely, though some exchanged glances that made her cheeks flush. One of them, a woman with carefully styled hair, leaned forward. "James, you could have chosen anyone. Why her?" The words were sharp, but James didn't flinch. "Because she's strong, because she's kind, because she doesn't give up, even when life tries to break her. That's more beautiful to me than anything money can buy. His voice was steady, his gaze unwavering. Diep lowered her head, tears stinging her eyes. She wasn't used to being defended so openly, so fiercely. A warmth spread through her chest, cutting through the cold sting of judgment. But not everyone was convinced. Another friend chuckled. "James, you're always the romantic, but marriage is practical too. Don't you think you need someone who matches your status? Business partners? Investors? They'll talk." James's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. "Let them talk. I don't measure love by business deals. Diep is my choice, my future wife. That's final." The room quieted, his words leaving no room for argument. Some nodded, others looked away, but the line had been drawn. James had chosen his side, and it was hers. Later, when the guests had gone, Diep stood by the window, looking out at the glittering city lights. Her heart still wrestled with doubt, but James's words echoed in her mind. "My future wife. That's final." She whispered, almost to herself, "Why do you fight so hard for me?" James stepped beside her, his hand slipping into hers. "Because you're worth it, and one day, I hope you'll see yourself the way I see you." The days that followed brought small changes. James continued to introduce Diep as his fiancée, whether to colleagues, neighbors, or relatives. Each time he said it, her heart fluttered, half from fear of rejection, half from the thrill of being claimed so openly. Some people smiled warmly, others questioned or frowned, but James never hesitated. And slowly, Diep began to lift her head a little higher to meet the eyes that looked at her with doubt. Still, challenges remained. At a family gathering, one of James's cousins whispered within earshot, "She's not even pretty, and she's poor. What does she really have to offer him?" Diep's heart clenched, but before she could shrink back, James spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "She has everything that matters. She has a heart stronger than anyone I know. She has resilience, courage, and kindness. And she has my love. That's more than enough." The cousin fell silent, and Diep's chest swelled with emotion. For the first time, she felt the wall between their worlds weaken, if only slightly. That night, as they walked home, James squeezed her hand. "Did you hear what I said?" Diep nodded, her voice soft but firm. "Yes, and I'll try. I'll try to believe it too." Under the streetlights, her steps felt lighter. The whispers might not stop. The doubts might never fully fade. But with James beside her, speaking her name with pride, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could belong in his world without losing herself. And as the city hummed around them, Diep carried not only her insecurities, but also a growing sense of strength. The road ahead would not be easy, but it was theirs to walk together.